The door of Silas's cabin splintered inward without ceremony, crashing against the wall with a sound like breaking bone. A woman filled the frame, a silhouette of impossible height and desperate fury, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged white plumes against the encroaching chill of dusk. She was Elara, the widow of a man who had known too much, and the entire county knew Bartholomew Thorne wanted her silenced. Behind her, the shouts of men echoed through the pines, the hungry sound of a closing trap. Silas, the quiet cowboy who had buried his heart on this desolate patch of land 5 years prior, didn't move from his chair by the cold hearth. His hand rested near the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker on the table, a relic of a life he had sworn to forget. Dust motes danced in the amber light of a single lantern between them, each a silent witness to her desperation. She stumbled forward, kicking the broken door shut, her chest heaving. Her shadow was a giantess cast across the rough-hewn walls of his self-imposed prison. "They're here," she stated, the words a tremor of fact, not fear. Thorne's dog's Silas's gaze remained fixed on the fireless stones, his face a mask carved from grief and granite. "This ain't your fight, woman." "It ain't mine," neither's. Her laugh was a shard of glass. "It is now." She took another step, her presence commanding the small space, her eyes locking onto his. In them, he saw not a plea for rescue, but a challenge forged in the crucible of absolute finality. She offered the only currency she had left. "Claim me tonight, and I'll be yours forever." The words hung in the air, audacious and insane. It was not a proposition of love, but a declaration of war using the only shield the law might grudgingly recognize. A grin, sharp and predatory and utterly without joy, stretched across her face. It was the grin of a cornered animal choosing its own terms for the final battle. "Marry me, cowboy. Right here. Right now. Make me your intended bride. And dare them to lay a hand on the future Mrs. Silas Kane." Silas's world, which had been a quiet, grey expanse of memory and regret, fractured under the weight of her demand. The silence in the cabin became a living thing, thick with the smell of pine, old dust, and her wild, rain-lashed scent. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and truly looked at her. Elara was not just tall, she was magnificent in her defiance, a storm-tossed titan with fire in her eyes and a will that seemed to bend the very air around her. The shouts outside grew louder, closer. A heavy fist hammered against the door, rattling the splintered wood in its frame. "We know you're in there, widow. Thorne wants a word." The voice was gravelly, arrogant, accustomed to obedience. Silas's gaze shifted from Elara to the holstered gun on the table. It was more than a weapon, it was a promise he had made to himself, a vow of peace sealed with the ashes of his wife and child. To touch it was to break that vow, to re-enter a world of violence he had barely survived. Yet, in Elara's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own loss, the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. He saw the shadow of the same tyrant, Thorne, who held the entire valley in his fist. A flicker of something dormant, something honorable and dangerous, stirred in the barren landscape of his soul. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and fluid. He was not a large man, but he moved with a coiled stillness that promised sudden, lethal action. He walked past her, his hand closing not on the gun, but on the heavy iron bolt of the door. "You make a hard bargain," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to speech. He slid the bolt home. Then, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. A man ought to know his bride's name. Relief, stark and overwhelming, warred with the tension on her face. "Elara." "Elara Vance." He gave a slow, somber nod. Silas Kane. He picked up the Colt, the weight of it familiar and terrible in his palm, and slid it into the holster on his hip. His fortress of grief had just become a battlefield. Silas unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch, into the dying light. 3 of Thorne's men stood in the clearing, their smirks fading as they registered the quiet cowboy standing before them, the legendary peacemaker strapped to his hip. He was a ghost from the county's more violent past, and his reappearance was an unwelcome omen. The lead man, a brute named Jeb, spat a wad of tobacco near Silas's boot. "Step aside, Kane. Our business is with the woman." Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The chill in his tone was enough to frost the air. The woman's name is Elara Kane. My intended. Her business is now my business. And I find your tone discourteous. He let the word settle. The threat was unspoken but absolute. To touch her was to cross him, and stories of what happened to men who crossed Silas Kane were still told in hushed tones in the saloons. Jeb's bravado faltered. He exchanged a nervous glance with his companions. This was not the simple matter of collecting a scared widow. This was something else entirely. After a tense standoff, where the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the heavy breathing of nervous men, Jeb grunted. Thorn ain't gonna like this. Silas's expression remained unchanged. I expect he won't. With a final, hateful glare, the men backed away, melting into the twilight. Silas watched them go before turning back into the cabin and bolting the door. Elara was leaning against the table, her strength finally failing her. In her hands, she clutched a heavy, leather-bound satchel as if it were a shield. They'll be back, she whispered, her voice trembling. With more men. Thorn doesn't suffer defiance. Silas nodded, his gaze falling to the satchel. Then you'd best tell me what's in that bag. You'd best tell me the real price of this arrangement. She slid it across the table to him. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. The price, she said, her eyes meeting his, is everything. That satchel holds Bartholomew Thorn's entire empire of sin. It's my husband's ledger. It's the reason he's dead. And it's the reason we will be, unless we use it first. The ledger felt profane in Silas's hands. Its worn leather cover was cold to the touch, a tombstone for Elara's husband and a declaration of war against Thorn. He opened it on the table under the lantern's solitary glow. The pages were filled with a small, precise script, a meticulous accounting of a decade of corruption. Names, dates, and figures swam before his eyes: illegal land seizures disguised as foreclosures, extortion payments from terrified shopkeepers, bribes to county officials. It was the secret history of the valley, a litany of greed written in ink and paid for with ruin. My husband, Thomas, he was Thorn's accountant, Elara explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, fueled by a righteous anger. He saw the wickedness, but he was a gentleman, trapped by fear. He started keeping this second ledger, a true one, as a penance. A way to live with himself. He meant to give it to the federal marshals. Thorn found out. He arranged an accident with a horse. Her gaze was unflinching. Thorn doesn't know I have this. He thinks it was lost. He only wants me silenced because he fears what I might know. He has no idea this proof exists. Silas traced a finger down a column of figures. He understood now. This wasn't just about sheltering a widow, it was about guarding the one weapon that could bring the tyrant down. The cabin, once his refuge from the world, was now the last bastion against Thorn's power. They were trapped, two ghosts in a box, with the valley's darkest secrets between them. That night, under the watchful gaze of the cold moon, they formalized their desperate pact. On a spare piece of paper from one of his empty supply crates, Silas wrote out a simple, declarative document, a marriage contract. It was a lie, a legal fiction meant to be a shield. They both signed it, their names stark and serious in the flickering light. Elara's hand was steady. Silas's was steadier. As he signed his name beside hers, he felt an unexpected jolt. This paper, this fossud, was the first promise he had made to another living soul in 5 years. The contract, a symbol of their fake alliance, felt more real and binding than any iron chain. The days that followed were a study in tension and quiet observation. The cabin became a shared space, a fortress of two. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Silas would chop wood, his axe strokes echoing the stoic beat of his heart, while Elara would organize their meager supplies, her practical competence a quiet force against the encroaching dread. They spoke little, but their silence was not empty. It was filled with a growing awareness of each other. He saw the resilience in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her watchful eyes. She was no damsel, but a partner in this siege, as tough and unyielding as the mountain granite. She, in turn, began to see past his silent exterior to the profound sorrow that haunted him, the ghost of a loss so deep it had reshaped the man he was. Thorn's retaliation was not long in coming, and it was insidious. It began not with bullets, but with starvation. When Silas went to the general store in Redemption, the proprietor, a man named Miller whom Silas had known for years, refused to look him in the eye. "Sorry, Silas," Miller mumbled, his face pale with fear. "Your credit's no good here. Thorne's orders. He's called in all my debts. I can't sell to you. Not even for cash. He'd ruin me. It was the same story at the smithy, the same at the livery. Thorne was strangling them, cutting them off from the world, turning the entire valley into a cage. He was demonstrating his power, making an example of them. They were forced to survive on what Silas could hunt and what little they had stored. One evening, as Elara salted a rabbit Silas had caught, her hand brushed his. The contact was electric, a sudden spark in the cold, tense air. They both froze, looking at each other. In that moment, the fake marriage, the contract born of desperation, was tested by the first flicker of a genuine, unspoken truth. They were not just allies. They were becoming something more, something forged in the crucible of their shared peril and a nascent, dangerous respect. The turning point came on a cold, rain-swept night, the kind that leaches warmth from a man's very bones. They were huddled by the fire, the ledger open on the table between them, a silent third party to their confinement. Elara was methodically going through the pages, looking for any weakness, any name of an outsider who might be immune to Thorne's influence. Her finger stopped on a page near the back, dated 5 years ago. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What was the name of your homestead?" Before you moved here, the question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Black Creek Crossing," Elara drew in a sharp breath. She turned the ledger towards him, her finger trembling as she pointed to a single entry. It was neat, clinical, and utterly monstrous. Black Creek Crossing, acquisition. Payment to J. Corrigan for services rendered, controlled burn, removal of squatters. Cost, $200. The price of his world. The price of his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Lily. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a stray spark from a lantern he had failed to extinguish. It was a transaction. A line item in a book of evil. The grief that had been Silas's constant companion for 5 years, a dull and heavy shroud, did not lessen. It transformed. The immense weight of his sorrow began to glow with a white-hot incandescence. It condensed, sharpened, from a formless ache into a single, cold, crystalline point of purpose. He slowly stood up, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, she saw the man he used to be, the man whose name had inspired fear and respect. The quiet cowboy was gone. In his place stood an avenging angel clad in denim and grief. The fight was no longer about protecting her or the ledger. It was about justice for the ghosts who haunted this cabin with him. "He didn't just take my future," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He stole my past." The next morning, the rain had ceased, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. Silas was no longer a man in hiding. He moved with a chilling deliberation, cleaning his rifle, checking every cartridge in his belt. He was preparing for war. Elara watched him, her heart aching for the new pain she had unearthed, but also filled with a fierce pride for the man who refused to remain broken. "Where are you going?" she asked, though she already knew. "To town," he replied, not looking up from his task. "Thorne thinks these people are his herd. He thinks they're cattle, broken by fear. It's time to remind them they're men." He saddled his horse, the creak of the leather a stark sound in the morning stillness. He strapped the ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, behind his saddle. It was his proof, his sermon, his declaration. He rode into Redemption not as a pariah, but as a reckoning. The townspeople watched him pass, their faces etched with fear and curiosity. He dismounted not at the saloon, Thorne's seat of power, but in the center of the dusty main street. He went first to the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus whose shoulders were slumped with debt. He opened the ledger and showed Gus the entry detailing how Thorne had acquired the note on his forge for pennies on the dollar through a proxy, bleeding him dry. He went to Miller at the general store and showed him the meticulous record of extortion, the protection and money that kept his family fed but his spirit starved. One by one, he sought them out. The farmers, the stable hands, the ordinary folk. He did not make grand speeches. He simply showed them the truth in black and white. He showed them that their individual misfortunes were not random acts of fate, but calculated moves in Thorne's predatory game. He was planting seeds of rebellion in the barren soil of their fear, watering them with the ink of Thorne's own crimes. A few spat on the ground and walked away, too broken to hope. But others looked up. In the eyes of Gus the blacksmith, a spark of his forge fire returned. In Miller's face, Shane gave way to a glimmer of defiance. Silas was no longer just one man against a tyrant. He was the catalyst for a sleeping giant, the collective will of a community pushed too far. Word of Silas's ride into redemption traveled faster than a prairie fire. It reached Bartholomew Thorne in his opulent office above the saloon, a room furnished with stolen wealth and choked with arrogance. He stood at the window, looking down at the town he considered his personal property. The news that the quiet, broken cowboy was showing his ledger, his private ledger, to the common rabble sent a jolt of pure fury through him. He had underestimated the widow, he had underestimated the cowboy. He had believed them to be isolated and weak, easily crushed. Now, they were becoming a symbol of defiance, and that was a threat he could not tolerate. His orders were swift and brutal. "Jeb," he roared, his voice carrying through the saloon. "Get every man who draws my pay. We're going to that cabin on the ridge. We're going to burn it to the ground with them inside it. And we're going to get my book." As Thorne's men gathered, a different kind of gathering began in the heavens. The clear morning sky began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds massed on the western horizon, rolling in with an unnatural speed. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of imminent rain and violence. This was no ordinary squall, it was a tempest, a physical manifestation of the storm of retribution that was about to break over the valley. At the cabin, Silas and Elara prepared. They barricaded the windows, leaving only small slits for firing. They laid out their ammunition, Silas's rifle and his Colt, and a heavy shotgun Thomas had left behind, which Elara handled with grim competence. They were hopelessly outnumbered, a tiny island of defiance about to be swallowed by a sea of malice. As the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy like pellets of lead, Silas looked at Elara. The fear was there, but beneath it was an unbreakable resolve. "I never thanked you," he said, his voice low. "For waking me up." She gave him a small, sad smile. "And I never thanked you for giving me a place to make a stand." The sky cracked open, and the heavens wept as Thorne and his army of thugs appeared on the ridge, their dark forms silhouetted against the malevolent, storm-racked sky. The siege began with a volley of rifle fire that chewed at the cabin's log walls, splintering wood and filling the air with the scent of gunpowder and pine. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the clearing into a sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening percussion that merged with the roar of the guns. Inside, Silas and Elara moved with the desperate efficiency of soldiers in a last stand. He would fire the rifle from one window, a steady, methodical report that found its mark more often than not, then moved to another position. Elara, her tall frame braced against the wall, covered the other side with the shotgun, its thunderous blasts carving gaping holes in the ranks of Thorne's advancing men. They were a symphony of resistance, their movements timed, their purpose singular. For every man they dropped, two more seemed to take his place, their dark figures emerging from the deluge like demons from the mire. The light inside the cabin grew dim as the storm raged, the world outside becoming a maelstrom of noise, shadow, and violence. A bullet shattered the lantern, plunging them into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the brief, searing flashes of lightning and the muzzle blasts of their own guns. Jeb, Thorne's lead thug, made a mad dash for the porch, hoping to break down the door. A flash of lightning silhouetted him, and in that instant, a single shot from Silas's Colt rang out. Jeb crumpled into the mud, his charge ending in a silent heap. But the pressure was relentless. They were running low on ammunition. The walls could not hold forever. Thorn, watching from a safe distance, screamed at his men to press forward, his voice a raw shriek of fury against the howl of the wind. Hope was a dying ember. It seemed their defiance would be extinguished here, in the dark and the rain, their story ending in blood and fire. But then, through the cacophony of the storm and the battle, a new sound emerged. It was a roar not of nature, but of men. A chorus of righteous fury rising from the valley below. Out of the sheets of rain and swirling mist, they came. Gus the blacksmith was at the forefront, his massive hammer held aloft like a war banner. Behind him was Miller from the store, his face grim, holding an old hunting rifle. Farmers with pitchforks, stable hands with rusty sidearms, townspeople armed with little more than courage and a burning need for justice. They were not an army. They were a flood. An uprising of the oppressed, their fear finally burned away by the fire Silas had ignited. They swarmed up the ridge, their battle cry mixing with the thunder, and fell upon the flank of Thorn's hired guns. The besiegers became the besieged. The professional thugs, caught completely by surprise, faltered. They were prepared to fight a lone cowboy and a widow, not the entire town of Redemption. The battle turned into a chaotic, swirling melee in the mud and rain. Bartholomew Thorn saw his power dissolving before his very eyes. His men were breaking, fleeing from the wave of vengeful townsfolk. In a panic, he drew his own pistol and made a desperate run for the cabin, intending to kill Silas and Elara himself and retrieve his ledger. The cabin door burst open, but it was Silas who filled the frame, his face a mask of cold judgment. Thorn raised his pistol, but Silas was faster. He didn't draw. He lunged forward, tackling Thorn and sending them both sprawling into the mud. It was not a clean duel of the West. It was a primal, brutal struggle. They rolled and grappled, fists flying, grunting like animals. Finally, Silas gained the upper hand. He wrenched the pistol from Thorn's grasp and pressed the barrel of his own Colt against the tyrant's temple. Thorn froze, his arrogant face smeared with mud, his eyes wide with terror. "Do it," he spat, trying to find a sliver of his old authority. But Silas looked past him, at the faces of the community he had galvanized. He saw not a thirst for blood, but a need for a new dawn. He lowered the gun. "No," Silas said, his voice clear and strong above the subsiding storm. "Your life will be your prison." At that moment, a lone rider appeared, the county marshal, summoned hours ago by Miller's boy. Silas stood up, leaving Thorn broken in the mud, and handed the marshal the oil-soaked ledger. Justice had arrived. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. Sunlight, brilliant and golden, pierced through the clouds, washing over the valley. The air was clean, the world reborn. Thorn and his remaining men were led away in chains, their reign of fear brought to a quiet, ignominious end. The people of Redemption stood in the clearing around Silas's cabin, their makeshift weapons held loosely at their sides. They were muddy, bruised, but their faces held a new light, the light of pride and ownership. They were no longer victims. They had taken their town back. In the weeks that followed, Redemption began to live up to its name. With Thorn's corrupt empire dismantled, the town started to heal. Debts were re-examined, stolen lands were returned, and a council was formed, with Gus the blacksmith and Miller the shopkeeper at its head. The center of the community was no longer a tyrant's office, but the collective will of its people. Silas's cabin was slowly transformed. The barricades came down. Elara planted a small garden of hardy mountain flowers near the porch. The ghosts of the past, while not forgotten, no longer held dominion. The fortress of grief had become the foundation for something new. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the mountains, Silas and Elara stood on the porch. The air was peaceful. He took a piece of paper from his pocket. It was the fake marriage contract they had signed in desperation. He held it for a moment, then tore it into small pieces, letting the wind carry them away like confetti. He turned to her, his quiet cowboy's face softened by an emotion he had thought long dead. He took her hand, his touch now gentle and full of promise. "Elara," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "The bargain is fulfilled. You are free. She looked up at him, her great height no longer a sign of defiance but of grace. A true, radiant smile illuminated her face. No, Silas, she replied, her voice soft. The claim was for a night. But the promise was forever. And I intend to keep it, he smiled back, a real smile that reached his winter sky eyes and melted the last of the frost. He leaned in and claimed her, not with a contract or a bargain, but with a kiss that sealed a future forged in fire and redeemed by love.